The yard was wide and colorless, the kind of space that had forgotten what it meant to be lived in. Grass had grown unevenly through cracks in the packed dirt, pale and stiff from frost. The fences leaned outward, their posts wrapped in rusted wire that hummed faintly when the air shifted. Somewhere, a metal sheet tapped against wood, soft, irregular, like a heartbeat struggling to remember its rhythm. Through the center of that silence walked a goose. Her feathers were white once, though the years had dulled them to a weary gray. A thin strand of mud clung to one side of her neck. Each step she took left a faint impression in the ground. Not enough to last, not enough to matter. No one saw her pass. No one heard her steps. The only sound was her breathing, slow and even, rising in thin puffs of mist that disappeared before they could touch the air. She moved with purpose, though there was nowhere to go. Her eyes, dark and still, followed a path that didn't exist anymore. Between the sagging posts, across the place where grass met shadow, toward the barn that leaned like a sleeping giant. The barn door was open just enough to see inside. The darkness there was heavy, not deep, the kind that holds the smell of dust, hay, and something older than both. The goose stopped at the threshold, neck stretched forward, listening. Silence. Then a creak, slow, uneven, from within. The wind hadn't made it. There was no wind. She stepped closer, webbed feet pressing into soft earth. The sound was small but strange in its clarity. A single wet click, swallowed instantly by the cold air. She crossed the threshold. The light inside was thin and yellow, spilling through the gaps in the boards. Dust moved lazily in its path, swirling like ash. The barn was empty. Old tools hung on the walls. A hammer, a rusted hook, the faint outline where something larger had once been. The floor was scattered with hay, matted flat and damp. The goose walked slowly between the beams of light. In one corner lay a trough, wooden, cracked, lined with the residue of water long gone. Beside it, a rope hung from the ceiling, the frayed end swaying just slightly, as if remembering motion. The goose tilted her head. Her reflection appeared faintly in a puddle below, blurred by the ripples of her breath. The image trembled, doubled, then disappeared. She lowered her neck, pecked at the wood once, a dull tap, hollow and small. Then the sound came. A hum. Not loud, faint enough to mistake for imagination, rising from somewhere beneath the floor. The goose froze. Her head tilted again, one eye fixed on the ground. The hum grew steadier, vibrating softly through the boards, through the trough, through the air itself. It wasn't unpleasant. It was just there, constant, patient, like something that had been waiting a long time to be heard. She took one step back. The sound deepened slightly following her. Another step. The hum faded. Silence again. She looked toward the open door. The yard beyond it was white with frost, sunlight breaking through the gray sky in thin, uneven lines. The hum returned once, faintly, almost a sigh, then vanished again. The goose stepped outside. Her feet pressed against the cold ground, but no sound followed. The world swallowed every movement. She turned once toward the barn, neck curved like a question. Nothing moved. The fences creaked softly in the distance, their shadows long and crooked against the dirt. She began to walk again, slow and steady, back across the yard. Behind her, the puddle inside the barn rippled once more, just once, as if something beneath it had taken a breath. The goose didn't look back. The sound never returned. Only her faint tracks remained, small, shallow, already fading beneath a thin breath of frost that fell from the air like forgotten dust. The yard waited, still and endless, for a sound that would not come. By the next morning, the frost had thickened. It lay across the yard in a thin white film, smooth as skin, unbroken even where the grass bent beneath it. The sky hung low, pale, uncommitted, neither day nor night. The goose stood by the fence. Her feathers were damp from the cold, each one stiff with tiny beads of ice. When she moved, they made no sound, only a faint brushing, like the whisper of fabric. Her breath fogged the air briefly, then disappeared. The yard was quieter than before. Even the metal sheet that used to rattle on the barn had gone still. The goose tilted her head. Something in the silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was listening. She took a step forward. Her webbed foot pressed against the frost, leaving no print. She took another. Still nothing. The world had grown soft enough to swallow her entirely. At the center of the yard sat the trough. She hadn't noticed it the day before, though it must have been there all along. A long, low shape of dark wood half sunk into the ground, rim lined with rusted nails. She approached slowly, neck stretched forward. The surface of the trough was covered in ice, thin and translucent, cracked in places. She tapped it once with her beak. A faint note echoed back, not the brittle sound of glass, but a low, dull tone that seemed to come from somewhere beneath. She stepped closer, listening. The hum returned. It was soft at first, barely there, then grew steadier, filling the cold air with vibration. The ice on the trough trembled, tiny cracks spreading outward like veins. The goose froze, her eyes fixed on the surface. Beneath the ice, something shifted. A ripple of light, faint and slow, like water moving under stone. The hum deepened, steady and rhythmic. The ground beneath her feet vibrated faintly. The boards of the barn creaked in response. Even the fence groaned softly as though the sound was moving through everything at once. Then, silence. The light beneath the ice dimmed and went out. The goose took a small step back. A single drop of water broke through the center of the trough, rolled down the side, and froze mid-fall. She turned her head toward the barn. The door was still half open, dark inside. A faint line of frost had crept up the edges of the doorway, curling along the frame like a slow-growing vine. She walked toward it. Each step she took left a faint trail of melted frost that vanished within seconds. The air inside the barn was colder. It smelled of iron and old straw. The puddle from yesterday had frozen solid, its surface smooth and opaque. She stood by it, staring. Beneath the ice, faint outlines, thin lines curved, uncertain, shimmered and disappeared again. They weren't reflections. They were underneath. The hum returned, louder this time. It filled the barn, low and full, pressing against the wood, the air, the walls. Dust rose from the beams in thin clouds, spinning like smoke. The rope from the ceiling swayed gently, though there was no breeze. The goose didn't move. The sound lasted several heartbeats, then broke. The silence that followed wasn't silence at all, but absence. The hum hadn't stopped. It had gone somewhere else. The puddle cracked down the middle, just once. A soft, delicate sound, sharp as breath. The goose flinched backward, wings half open, but the air stayed still. The ice didn't break further. The line that ran through it glowed faintly for a moment, then faded. She looked around the barn again, at the rope, at the tools, at the walls that no longer looked quite straight. Something in the light had changed. It had gone dimmer, though the sun hadn't moved. The goose turned toward the door and walked back outside. The yard was exactly as it had been, but the color had drained away. Everything was gray, even the air itself. She stopped by the trough. The ice there had sealed itself again, perfect and smooth. Her reflection looked back at her, warped, doubled, eyes darker than before. The hum didn't return. The goose stood still for a long time, listening to the shape of the silence. Then she began to walk again, across the yard, toward the fence that leaned toward the horizon. Her steps made no sound. Her shadow followed faintly across the frost. And when she passed through the gate, the trough trembled once, just enough for a single crack to appear along its edge, whispering into the cold. Someone is still here. By the third morning, the frost had begun to melt. Not from sunlight, there was none, but from something deeper, something slow and quiet, moving beneath the ground. The yard glistened faintly, as if sweating in the cold. The goose was awake before the light changed. She stood near the fence, feathers puffed against the damp air. Her breath came in steady clouds that drifted apart like small ghosts. The trough was still there at the center of the yard, waiting. Its ice had melted during the night. The surface now reflected a thin gray sky that looked more like water than air. The goose took a few careful steps forward. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She had learned not to trust the silence here. Every time she crossed the yard, it felt as though the air shifted just enough to notice. When she reached the trough, she stopped and looked down. The water was clearer now. Beneath it, something shimmered faintly. Not light, not movement, just the memory of both. The reflection of her own face seemed to move, even when she didn't. The goose tilted her head. Then, softly, it began again. The hum. It started in the distance, faint and low, as though the earth itself was remembering a song it had once forgotten. The water rippled, gentle at first, then in small circles spreading outward from the center. The goose didn't move. Her eyes widened slightly, her breath stopped. The hum grew stronger, resonant, no longer just beneath her, but around her. The boards of the barn creaked. The air above the trough shimmered, bending light like heat, though the cold was sharp enough to sting. Then, another sound joined it. A knock, soft, hollow, like something striking the wood beneath the trough from below. The goose took one step back. The knock came again, two, then three, in an uneven rhythm. She froze, neck stretched tall, feathers bristling faintly. Her reflection trembled in the water. The knock stopped. The hum changed tone, now higher, almost a voice, though no words could be made out. She turned her head slightly, looking toward the barn. The door moved. Just once, an inch, maybe less, but enough to let the light catch the edges. A sliver of shadow shifted inside, slow and careful, like the turn of a thought. The goose took another step back, her feet pressing small wet shapes into the soil. The hum stopped. The water stilled. Only the echo of it lingered, faint, metallic, running through the ground like a wire carrying something that hadn't decided whether it was alive. Then, the smell came. Wet earth, iron, smoke. The goose turned her head sharply. A thin column of mist rose from the far end of the yard, near the place where the fence met the trees. It twisted once, drifted upward, and dissolved into the colorless sky. The air changed again. Not warmer, not colder, just heavier, full of pressure, as though the whole world had taken one slow breath and was waiting for permission to let it go. The goose began to walk, slow at first, then faster, her feet soft against the earth. She crossed the yard, passing the trough without another look. When she reached the gate, she stopped. The wood was wet and slick beneath her beak as she brushed it once, testing. The sound it made, faint, hollow, broke apart halfway through. She pushed through the gap. The ground beyond was softer, greener. It hadn't felt her steps in months, maybe years. The hum didn't follow. The wind didn't return either. But behind her, in the yard, something shifted. The water in the trough began to move again, though no one was there to see it. Ripples spread slowly from the center, forming rings that widened until they touched the rim. At the bottom, something pale gleamed for the first time. The curve of metal, smooth and circular, catching what little light there was. A bell. Small. Rusted. Whole. It vibrated once, sending a single pulse through the water. Not a sound, just the shape of one. And when it stilled again, the yard seemed to breathe for the first time in years. The goose stopped just beyond the gate. Her head turned slightly as if listening to something distant. Then she kept walking, into the field that waited in silence. Behind her, the trough reflected the sky perfectly, and in that reflection, for the briefest moment, something moved that wasn't the wind. The fourth morning came quietly, as if the world had agreed to wake but not to speak. The frost was gone. The air was warmer now, though it carried no scent of spring, only the faint smell of rust and wet wood. The sky hung low, smooth and pale, like old glass. The goose stood near the barn. Her feathers were still damp from mist, the edges darkened with dirt. The trough in the center of the yard was full again. Not overflowing, just full, as though someone had come in the night and refilled it by hand. But no one had. The water was too still for that. It was perfectly smooth, a flawless mirror, reflecting the barn and the sky and the faint shape of the goose herself. The air above it shimmered slightly, as if it were warmer than the world around it. The goose stepped closer. Her reflection followed, a half second behind, its movements almost, but not quite, her own. She paused at the edge. The water smelled faintly of metal and rain. It was clear now. She could see straight to the bottom. The bell was still there, the same small curve of rusted iron, lying sideways in the mud, its surface dull but clean, as if the water had been polishing it in her absence. The goose lowered her head, beak touching the surface. Ripples spread outward, slow and perfect. The hum began again. It was softer this time, almost tender. The sound came not from beneath the ground or the barn, but from everywhere. The trough, the air, the walls of the yard. Even the boards of the barn seemed to tremble in rhythm, like they were remembering a song they used to hold. The goose didn't move. The hum deepened, its rhythm slowing until each vibration felt like a heartbeat. The bell beneath the water shifted slightly, tilting upward, releasing a thin stream of bubbles that drifted lazily to the surface and broke without a sound. The goose blinked. The sound stopped, but the air didn't go still this time. It held something, faint and electric. The reflection on the surface began to move on its own, independent from her. The goose lifted her head. The image stayed bent toward the water. Then, faintly, the sound of footsteps, not hers. Soft, steady, walking somewhere behind her, crossing the yard. The goose turned sharply, wings twitching. No one was there. The ground was undisturbed. The fence leaned as it always had. But the sound continued. Slow, deliberate steps, circling the trough, pressing against the silence, until the yard seemed to tighten around them. The goose took a step back, her neck arched, eyes fixed on the sound that had no shape. Then the bell rang, not loud, not sharp, a single note, soft, dull, like a memory of sound. The air trembled. The reflection broke apart. The sky and the water folded into ripples, and for one brief moment, there was movement. The impression of feathers, of water spreading outward from invisible wings. Then everything stilled again. The hum was gone. The footsteps stopped. The goose lowered her head toward the trough once more. The water was clear again. The bell lay still. But something had changed. A faint current ran beneath the surface now, swirling lazily around the bell, just enough to disturb the reflection. The goose watched it for a long time, the faint light flickering across her eyes. Then she turned toward the open barn. Inside, the puddle that had once frozen solid was gone. Only a dark stain remained where the wood had warped. The rope that hung from the ceiling moved faintly, turning once, then stopping. The air smelled of dust and rain. The goose stepped forward, crossing the threshold into shadow. Her feet pressed soft shapes into the dirt. At the far end of the barn, the trough there was empty too, its base cracked, its surface lined with rust. But beneath it, faintly, came the same sound she had heard since the first morning. The hum, low, faint, still alive. It moved through the ground like a pulse, slow and endless. The goose stood there, still as stone, listening. The world was quiet. The wind did not return. But the air had weight now, the kind that means something is breathing, even if you can't see it. After a while, she turned back toward the door. Outside, the sky had started to change. It was darker, heavier, the color of iron just before rain. The goose walked back into the yard. Her steps made no sound. The trough was still. The bell did not move. She passed it, slow and deliberate, crossing the yard as the first drops began to fall. Too few to be rain, too soft to be noticed, yet enough to leave small circles on the surface of the water. The bell rang once more, faint, almost human. The goose stopped, looked back. Then she kept walking, through the gate, into the field beyond, her body fading into the colorless light. Behind her, the ripples spread wider until the water went still again, and the yard returned to silence. But the earth beneath it kept breathing.